A king kneels in the torchlit corridors of Angkor, fingers trembling over a map carved into stone. Outside, the jungle holds its breath, listening for the crack of power. One command, one hesitation, and the empire of the God Kings tips toward glory or ruin. Moments like this did not change history, they broke it open. Subscribe to Empire Unknown, where history breathes again. The empire that would one day carve mountains into temples began not with bronze trumpets or banners of conquest, but with mud gripping bare feet. In the low, flooded plains of ancient Cambodia, life was a negotiation with the monsoon, a fragile pact between hunger and hope. For half the year, the waters rose, swallowing fields, homes, and boundaries. For the other half, they receded, leaving behind cracked earth, silted memories, and the stubborn resolve of people who refused to be erased by weather. Their world smelled of wet soil and burning rice stalks, a land where the horizon shimmered with heat by noon and vanished under storms by dusk. It was here, in this shifting landscape, that the earliest Khmer tribes pressed their palms into clay and called it home. Before kings, there were chieftains, men who ruled more through charisma than decree. Their authority was measured in harvests, the weight of their words, and the number of warriors willing to stand behind them. Each village existed like an island, separated by marshes that hummed with insects and whispered with ghosts. The people believed that spirits lived in every tree root, every ripple of water, every stone pulled from the riverbed. They made offerings before cutting new fields, and in the dark, smoke-filled huts, elders spoke of ancestors watching from the rain. Survival required appeasing both the sky and the unseen, for both could bless or destroy without warning. But the monsoon was not the only threat. Rival clans watched each other across the wetlands, trading cautiously, feuding often, and occasionally uniting only to fracture again. Territory meant food, food meant followers, followers meant power. It was a fragile balance, easily broken by a single bad season or an ambitious leader. Iron, still rare, became a source of fear and awe, its gleam a promise of victory, its scarcity a reminder that not all tribes could wield it. When two chieftains disagreed, the clash of iron tools, weepers, sickles, spearheads, echoed across the plains like thunder, announcing the first storm of war. Yet even in the volatility, something new began to stir. Slowly, painfully, the marshlands gave rise to the idea of unity, an idea too large for any one village, too bold for men who still measured power in sacks of rice. The first whispers came from the waterways. The rivers, those serpent-like arteries snaking through the land, became the lifelines of trade. Boats carved paths between settlements, carrying rice, fish, salt, and stories. With each journey, the tribes learned more of each other, their fears, their strengths, their rituals, their temples of wood and thatch. A shared identity, subtle as a shifting current, began to form. Still, fear lingered. Every gain brought new anxieties. What they built could be destroyed by an enemy or by the sky itself. And so they prayed to spirits both gentle and ruthless. They carved guardian figures into posts, believing the wood absorbed danger. They burned incense before paddling into swamps known to swallow boats whole. They hammered iron beneath chants older than memory. Their world was not yet an empire, but it was no longer a scattering of isolated souls. Something was beginning to take shape, something that smelled of ambition. Archaeologists will someday find the remnants of these early settlements, pottery shards, traces of raised earth mounds, hints of primitive canals. But the chronicles of the age were written in sweat and fear, and the restless movements of human desire. Men dreamed of control over the unpredictable waters. Women whispered of families that could be bound into something stronger than blood. Elders wondered if the spirits favored unity, or if unity would anger the forces that thrive on chaos. Every belief pulsed with tension, as though the future of a civilization was already pressing against the fragile walls of the present. Then came a generation unwilling to remain small. These were the first visionaries, chieftains who saw not a village but a realm, not a harvest but a legacy.
They stood at the edge of the marshlands at dawn, watching how the mist rose like spirits leaving the earth, and they questioned whether the world belonged to the tribes or whether the tribes belonged to the world. Their ambitions were cautious, their movements deliberate, but the intention burning behind their eyes was unmistakable. They wanted permanence. They wanted power that would outlast the floodwaters. To achieve it, they would need to reshape the land itself. Primitive earthworks rose, dikes, canals, elevated homes. Farmers dug trenches under the supervision of men who insisted that the river's path could be controlled, even redirected. Each successful redirection felt like a miracle. Each failure reminded them that nature was still the undisputed ruler of their domain. But gradually, field by field, settlement by settlement, the land began to respond. Rice grew more reliably. Floodwaters could be delayed or diverted. Hunger, the most ancient enemy, loosened its grip. With stability came population. With population came complexity. With complexity came conflict. The tribes who mastered water gained leverage over those who remained at the mercy of the monsoon. Alliances shifted. Marriages forged political bonds. Warriors swore oaths beneath torchlight, pledging loyalty to leaders whose authority now extended beyond their own bloodline. A new form of leadership emerged, one not rooted solely in charisma, but in organization, in control, in vision. This was the seed of kingship. But the marshlands did not surrender easily. Even as new settlements rose, the old dangers remained. Crocodiles drifted in stagnant channels. Fever spread in the humid air. The monsoon did not care for human ambition. It arrived when it wished, often with fury. Villages still vanished under typhoons. Entire harvests were sometimes lost to floods. And in those desperate years, when the rivers swallowed children and the spirits stayed silent, the simmering resentments between tribes ignited into warfare. The battles were small by later standards, skirmishes in the reed-choked shallows, ambushes in the fog, but they carried the emotional weight of existential conflict. Warriors painted their faces to honor ancestors. Women sharpened blades with steady hands. Priests chanted for protection, their voices trembling as they offered sacrifices to unseen forces. Every clash strengthened some chieftains and destroyed others. The survivors learned quickly. Strength alone was not enough. Endurance required structure, unity, and belief in something greater than a village's borders. And so the people began to imagine a world beyond the marshes, beyond the scattered clans, beyond the fragile alliances. They imagined a kingdom, a single banner beneath which their waters could be tamed, their spirits appeased, their enemies deterred. A kingdom not yet written in stone, not yet shaped into temples, but etched into the minds of the living. A vision waiting for a ruler brave enough or desperate enough to claim it. The records of the era are fragmented. Some speak of a leader who first united the scattered communities, though his name shifts across oral traditions. Others insist the unity began slowly, an evolutionary tide, rather than the work of one ambitious soul. But in the silent spaces between these stories, another truth emerges. Unity was not born of conquest alone, but of fear, need, and the relentless drive of human aspiration. The marshlands still breathed around them, heavy with humidity, thick with insects, darkened by towering palms. But the people were no longer merely surviving. They were beginning to shape destiny. The first echoes of empire stirred in the waterlogged earth, in the rhythm of paddles on the river, in the chants rising across communal hearths. Something immense, fragile, and unstoppable was awakening. And in the earliest dawns of that awakening, as mist curled over paddies and the sky turned gold above the wetlands, the world held its breath, waiting to see whether this fragile dream would rise or drown. Some empires are born in fire, others rise quietly from the mud, already carrying the weight of their future collapse. He rose before dawn, long before the courtiers arranged their silks, long before the priests rehearsed their hymns. In the cool darkness, when torches still flickered like uncertain faith, he walked alone through the half-built sanctuary. The stone beneath his feet was rough, unpolished, impatient, and perhaps he was the same, a man stepping into a place no man was meant to stand. The air tasted of dust and incense, the first hints of empire gathering around him. But the silence carried another truth. Once he declared himself divine, there would be no return to the soft vulnerability of mortality. The early Khmer world had always blurred the boundary between human and spirit. Ancestors guided harvests, forest gods guarded streams. A sick child meant imbalance, a prosperous year meant favor. But this ruler, this visionary wrapped in the shadows of ambition, wanted more than protection. He wanted embodiment, to bind the power of the unseen to the authority of the living, to wear divinity not as myth but as title. It was a desire born of fear as much as aspiration. The marshland tribes had begun to unify, but unity was brittle, held together by charisma and circumstance. Rivals waited, patient as serpents in dark water. If he did not rise higher than all others, he would be dragged down into the mud with them. That was when the idea took root, not a king blessed by the gods, but a king as a god. It began quietly, whispered among priests who understood the language of both ritual and politics. They tested it in ceremonies, layering symbolism into every offering. The king's breath aligned with sacred winds, his shadow measured against ancient markers, his throne positioned as the axis between heaven and earth. At first, the people regarded these changes with curiosity, then awe, then obedience. For if a ruler could stand at the center of the cosmic order, then perhaps he could command stability, prosperity, and peace. Perhaps the storms would listen to him. Perhaps the rivers would hesitate before flooding his lands. Power grew from belief, and belief sharpened power. The temples changed first. They rose not as simple sanctuaries, but as monuments to a living deity. Their foundations were sunk deep into soil that still held the bones of ancestors. Their towers imitated sacred mountains, homes of gods, implying that the divine throne reached upward toward the heavens and downward into the underworld. Every stone was a sentence, every carving a declaration. Warriors approached the construction sites with reverence, farmers arrived bearing offerings, elders bowed before walls that had not yet been completed. The empire's heartbeat quickened, pulsing through scaffolding and chisels and liturgical chants. But the transformation was not purely spiritual, it was strategic. A temple was stone made political. Its orientation dictated processions. Its reliefs proclaimed legitimacy. Its central shrine aligned the ruler with cosmic order. The more elaborate the complex, the more inescapable the message. Loyalty to the king was loyalty to the universe. Any rebellion became not just treason, but sacrilege. Rivals who once contested territory now hesitated. A claim against the throne risked offending the spirits, the ancestors, and the celestial balance itself. Power and piety fused into a single shimmering blade. Yet every rise casts a longer shadow. Inside the palace, the atmosphere thickened. Priests debated among themselves, softly at first, but with growing intensity. Some saw divine kingship as an evolution of tradition, a necessary step for unity. Others feared it. For if a man climbed too high above humanity, what happened when he faltered? What happened when he failed to summon rain, when disease spread, when enemies advanced? A mortal king could err, a god king could not. And expectation is a weight far heavier than a crown. The ruler felt this weight most acutely at night, when rituals had ended and the torches burned low. Alone in his chambers, he stared at his hands, hands that had bled in battle, hands that trembled when a child of his fell ill, hands that carried scars reminding him that flesh bleeds, fails. Yet by daybreak, those same hands were lifted by priests and kissed by officials as though they were instruments of divine will. The contradiction carved a quiet fracture in his spirit. But ambition, once awakened, refuses to sleep. Even the landscapes shifted under the gravity of his claim. Inside the palace, the atmosphere thickened. Priests debated among themselves, softly at first, but with growing intensity. Some saw divine kingship as an evolution of tradition, a necessary step for unity. Others feared it. For if a man climbed too high above humanity, what happened when he faltered? What happened when he failed to summon rain, when disease spread, when enemies advanced? A mortal king could err, a god king could not. And expectation is a weight far heavier than a crown. The ruler felt this weight most acutely at night when rituals had ended and the torches burned low. Alone in his chambers, he stared at his hands. Hands that had bled in battle, hands that trembled when a child of his fell ill. Hands that carried scars reminding him that flesh bleeds, fails. Yet by daybreak, those same hands were lifted by priests and kissed by officials as though they were instruments of divine will. The contradiction carved a quiet fracture in his spirit. But ambition, once awakened, refuses to sleep. Even the landscapes shifted under the gravity of his claim.
The marshlands were reshaped, carved into terraces and reservoirs. Roads extended in straight ceremonial lines, connecting settlements like veins connecting organs. Villages were instructed to send offerings, labor, and warriors for the divine endeavor of transforming the realm. The people accepted the burden because they believed, or feared, that their king's divinity required their sacrifice. And sacrifice, once given, demanded further justification. The more they offered, the more they needed him to be divine. As temples rose higher, so did tensions. Neighboring chieftains watched with growing unease. Some sent envoys to observe the rituals and return with reports wrapped in uncertainty. Others prepared for war, convinced that a king who claimed divinity could not be trusted with ordinary ambition. To them, divinity was a veil, one that concealed conquest. And they were not entirely wrong, for deep within the king's councils, strategies were whispered. Expansion, assimilation, dominance. If he was a god on earth, then every land was potentially his domain. The first conflicts sparked at the edge of the wetlands. Small at first, almost ritualistic, skirmishes meant to test resolve rather than topple kingdoms. Warriors marched with painted shields, invoking the divine ruler's name before clashing with rivals whose spirits were not yet bound to any one king. The battles were swift and decisive. Victory lent credence to divinity. Defeat was unthinkable. Each triumph tightened the knot between faith and authority until neither could be distinguished from the other. Inside the temples, the priests extended their influence. They wrote hymns describing the king as the axis of the world. They carved scenes of him triumphant over demons, symbols of chaos and disorder. They taught children to speak his name with reverence. And the children grew into adults who could no longer imagine a world without him at its center. But power gained through sanctity carries a different kind of danger. It isolates, it demands constant perfection, it denies weakness. Rumors began to whisper through the markets, quiet as the rustling of palm leaves. People wondered why the rains had been late one season, why soldiers had marched more frequently, why the king appeared less often in public ceremonies. The priests countered with assurances, but unease is a river that carves its own channels. Doubt seeped into the cracks of faith, subtle and patient. The ruler fought to maintain the balance. He expanded rituals, intensified offerings, increased the spectacle of divinity. But each gesture increased expectation. Each miracle demanded another. Each sign of favor needed to be exceeded. Where mortals rise and fall by seasons, gods must remain constant. He had placed himself on a summit from which every descent looked like disaster. And yet, even in the strain, he believed in the vision of a unified realm, believed that the gods stood behind him, believed that the fragile unity forged across marshlands could only be sustained through a throne touched by the heavens. His legacy would echo through generations. His claim would shape the architecture, governance, and soul of the Khmer Empire. But the cost of wearing divinity, of holding a realm together with the tension of belief, had already begun to show in the quiet lines around his eyes, the sleepless nights, the rituals performed with trembling breath. For in declaring himself a god, he had stepped into a realm where no mortal could stand without breaking. Even the greatest throne becomes perilous when a man must pretend he is more than human.
Long before the empire carved its gods into stone, it carved its future into water. The early kings stood at the edge of the floodplains and understood a truth that would define centuries. In this land, power flowed not through bloodlines or armies, but through the rivers that rose and fell like the breathing of the earth itself. To master the waters was to master destiny. To fail was to be swallowed by the monsoon. And so the Khmer turned toward the rivers, not with worship alone, but with ambition sharpened into engineering. At dawn, when the world was still a palette of gray, the first engineers stepped into the mud, their feet sinking into the pulse of the land. They were not scribes or nobles or priests. They were craftsmen, thinkers, observers of currents and soil, men who watched how water moved and imagined how it could be persuaded otherwise. They studied the bends of rivers, the fall of rain, the way silt gathered like secrets in the shallows. They understood that the river did not care for human desires. It would feed them one year, drown them the next. But if it could be guided, channeled, raised, held, the empire could rise beyond the reach of famine. It began with embankments, humble at first, long earth walls shaped by calloused hands, reinforced with timber. But each structure sparked new possibility. If water could be held back, it could be stored. If stored, it could be released. If released at the right moment, the fields would thrive. The first small reservoirs appeared like mirrors scattered across the plains, reflecting skies heavy with monsoon clouds. Villagers gathered around them with reverence, as though they were seeing a prophecy take shape. Word spread, more laborers came, so did more visionaries. With the king's blessing, the work expanded. Reservoirs grew until they resembled inland seas, barrays, massive artificial lakes stretching so wide that fishermen lost sight of the opposite shore. Their construction required faith and force in equal measure. Earth was dredged and moved, shaped into carefully calculated embankments that aligned with the course of the rising sun. The process was brutal. Hundreds worked knee-deep in water, hauling baskets of soil under the relentless heat. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others were pulled under by sudden currents. But the work continued. For each life lost, 1,000 more depended on the promise of water. The canals came next, narrow at first, then widening into arteries that stitched the kingdom together. Villagers lined up along their banks, pushing sharpened stakes into mud to guide the flow. Engineers mapped the terrain with eyes trained by experience, not by written diagrams. They understood that the land shifted under their feet. A canal built today could fail tomorrow if the monsoon returned too violently. So they listened to the earth, watched the way water hesitated or surged, adjusted their paths with the patience of artists sculpting a living element. Soon, the entire landscape became a masterpiece of hydrological intent. From above, had the sky allowed anyone such a view, the system would have looked like a vast geometric design. Canals feeding reservoirs, reservoirs feeding canals, water moving with purpose, guided by invisible hands. Hunger retreated, replaced by abundance. Rice grew in shimmering terraces, bright green against the dark earth. Villages expanded, trade flourished. The king's authority deepened, not because the people feared him, but because they trusted the waters he commanded. But with power came peril. For every structure they raised, the monsoon waited with quiet menace. It arrived each year with a temperament shaped by no human logic. Some seasons it came early, tapping gently at the embankments. Other years it unleashed its fury, slamming into the reservoirs with waves that roared like beasts. Engineers rushed along the banks, lanterns whipping in the storm winds, shouting orders drowned by thunder. If even one embankment failed, fields would vanish, villages would drown. The delicate rhythm of life, tuned so perfectly to their system, could collapse in a single night. And yet, success bred confidence. Confidence bred ambition. The empire pushed deeper into the marshlands, reshaping terrain that had once been left untouched. New canals cut through forests, new reservoirs rose beside temples. And each achievement was celebrated with ritual, offerings cast into waters that shimmered with the incense of belief. Priests performed ceremonies to bind the spirits of the rivers to the will of the king. Farmers knelt by the canal banks, dipping their hands into the current before planting their crops, whispering prayers for balance. But whispered beneath the prayers was a quiet anxiety. How long could humans hold dominion over something as restless as water?
The engineers themselves felt it most. Their triumphs were etched into stone, praised in royal halls, but their failures were buried in the mud, and the mud never forgot. They learned to sleep lightly, listening for the sound of rushing water in the night. They carried the weight of a truth no one dared to speak. Every reservoir was a promise that could break. Every canal was a risk disguised as order. Every rainy season was a test of faith, of skill, of luck. And still, they built. For the empire was growing, and growth demanded certainty. Rice fed armies, water fed rice, and so the king commanded more. Larger reservoirs, more elaborate canals, systems that stretched across distances once considered impossible. The capital hummed with the energy of expansion, its heart beating in sync with the flow of controlled water. Merchants arrived from distant lands, marveling at the ingenuity. Lords of the water, some called the Khmer, for no other kingdom had dared such mastery. Yet mastery is never absolute. There were signs, small at first. A canal that silted faster than expected. A reservoir whose water level dipped too low during an unusually harsh dry season. Embankments that cracked under heat. Engineers patched, dredged, shored, reinforcing their work with determination. But nature has patience deeper than stone. The rivers remembered their ancient paths. The monsoon remembered where it once roamed freely. And beneath the surface of each triumph lay a tension building grain by grain. The people did not see the cracks. They saw only abundance. The prosperity softened memories of hunger and hardened expectations. Children grew up believing the reservoirs had always been there. Farmers assumed the canals would always deliver water. Soldiers marched across bridges built on the confidence of controlled rivers. And the king, surrounded by advisors and priests, began to trust that the waters had submitted to his will. But water does not submit. It negotiates. It waits. In the quiet months between seasons, when the air hung thick and unmoving, some elders gazed upon the vast reservoirs with unease. They murmured that the system had become too large, too intertwined, too dependent on perfection. One breach could spread like fire. One storm could undo a generation's work. But their warnings faded into the hum of progress. No one wanted to imagine that the lifeline of the empire could also become its blade. And so the Khmer continued to shape their world, building waterworks so advanced that even centuries later their genius would defy comprehension. They became stewards of currents, architects of rainfall, sculptors of deltas. Their success sustained millions. Their confidence fortified the throne. But somewhere beyond the horizon, clouds gathered with ancient memory, and in their silent darkness, the rivers waited, ready to return to their old ways the moment vigilance faltered. For in a kingdom built on water, the boundary between prosperity and ruin was always one breath deep.
The first stone arrived before dawn, dragged by hundreds of men whose bodies shone with sweat under the pale sky. It slid across the earth on timber sleds, groaning like an ancient beast awakened from sleep. Dawn broke, and still they pulled, ropes biting into their shoulders, dust clinging to their hair, breath rising in exhausted clouds. Behind them, the king watched in silence. What he envisioned was not a building, not even a monument, but a mountain shaped by human will, a ladder between heaven and earth, carved from the bones of the land itself. It was an act of devotion, it was an act of ambition, it was an act of defiance. These stones came from quarries miles away, where workers chipped sandstone from the earth with iron tools that sparked in the dark. The blocks were massive, far heavier than any human should move, yet they traveled in endless processions. From quarry to river, from river to construction site, from construction site to sky. At times, the workers believed the stones had lives of their own, silent, patient lives, accepting the yoke of men but remembering the touch of nature. Each block carried stories of the Earth's ancient past, rewritten by the hands of thousands determined to reshape destiny. The site of Angkor rose from a clearing carved out of wilderness. Dense jungle pressed in from all sides, its canopy a tangle of shadow and breath.
The air smelled of sap, sweat, and incense. Draft animals strained. Overseers shouted orders. The rhythmic strike of chisels echoed across the plains like distant war drums. Bit by bit, sandstone transformed from raw geometry into divine architecture. Towers climbed upward, designed to resemble Mount Meru, the sacred cosmic mountain where gods were said to dwell. The goal was not merely to build a temple, but to replicate the architecture of myth, to tether divine realms to human soil. Sculptors followed behind the builders, working with precision that bordered on reverence. Their tools were extensions of their hands, and those hands moved with a grace that defied the harshness of their labor. They carved apsaras, celestial dancers frozen mid-step, their smiles eternal and enigmatic. They carved battles where kings rode elephants through swirling chaos. They carved gods seated on lotus thrones, eyes half closed, as if contemplating the rise and fall of entire worlds. Each figure was a story, each story a declaration, each declaration a reminder. This was the realm of a god-king. And in the shadow of their work, ambition grew. The king envisioned Angkor not merely as a temple, but as a statement to eternity, that here, in this realm, divine favor walked hand in hand with mortal authority. Each tower reaching skyward was a metaphor sharpened into stone. Each gallery stretching outward was a proclamation of dominion. The kingdom itself seemed to rise with the temple. Farmers spoke of the king's grandeur in their rice fields. Traders whispered of the construction effort as if it were a miracle. Even enemies hesitated, unsure whether they confronted a man with armies or a god with ambition. But beneath the grandeur, shadows lengthened. The workforce grew larger, a vast army of artisans, laborers, engineers, and slaves. Their lives converged on the temple site like tributaries feeding a great river. They ate together, slept in clusters of woven huts, and worked until their hands blistered and their joints stiffened. Some labored out of devotion, others out of fear, many out of obligation, for the temple was not just a spiritual undertaking, it was a political one. Refusing participation meant refusing the king, and refusing the king was an act against the cosmic order itself. Whispers began circulating among the workers. They spoke of how the structure seemed to devour resources, how new demands emerged each week, how the king's expectations seemed to grow faster than the temple itself. Some believed that the temple was cursed, that the spirits resented humanity's attempt to rise so high. Others insisted the gods were pleased and that the suffering of men was merely the price of glory. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between fear and faith. As the towers rose, the city around them transformed. Angkor became a living entity, its arteries formed by roads and canals, its breath carried by thousands of voices echoing through markets and courtyards. Massive pools reflected the temple spires, doubling them in shimmering illusions.
Bridges arched over water channels that pulsed with life. Traders from distant lands wandered the avenues in awe, their footsteps a testament to the gravity the temple exerted on the world. But grandeur has a shadow, and every shadow has a cost. The more Angkor grew, the more the king needed it to stand beyond reproach. Priests chanted elaborate rites, praying for continued favor. Rituals multiplied, offerings increased. Even the sculptors felt the pressure. Mistakes were not permissible, for a flawed carving could be interpreted as a flawed kingdom. And so they carved harder, becoming both creators and prisoners of their own craftsmanship. At night, when the workers slept, the unfinished towers loomed above them like watchful guardians. Moonlight draped the stone in silver, outlining the rising structure against the dark sky. In those hours, the temple seemed alive, breathing through the wind that passed through its corridors, listening through the cracks in its walls, waiting for its destiny to unfold. The king often walked among the scaffolding at night, his footsteps soft, his gaze sharpened by both pride and apprehension. He understood that the temple would outlive him. It would outlive his sons, his rivals, his priests. But would it preserve his legacy or expose it? Because a temple is never just stone. It is memory made solid. And memories have a way of revealing truths that kings prefer to hide.
As Angkor Wat, though not yet called by that name, rose toward completion, tensions simmered. Resources were stretched thin. Provinces grumbled about the burden placed upon them. Some whispered that the king had become consumed by the idea of divine architecture, that he sought immortality while mortals starved. But the whispers never reached him directly, or if they did, he turned them aside, believing that greatness demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice continued to feed the stones. The final stages of construction were the most dangerous. Scaffolding creaked under the weight of men working hundreds of feet above the ground. Stones swung from ropes as thick as a man's arm, each movement guided by shouts and prayers. A single misstep meant death, and death was not uncommon. Workers fell like leaves shaken loose by storm winds. Their bodies were carried away quietly, buried quickly, mourned privately. The temple rose anyway, indifferent to their absence. By the time the sacred towers pierced the sky, Angkor had become more than a capital. It was a declaration carved into the earth itself, a monument to ambition, a testament to a ruler who refused to live as a shadow of the gods, and instead chose to build a path toward them. The people gathered in awe, marveling at the scale, the symmetry, the impossible elegance of the structure. The king stood at its center, feeling both triumphant and vulnerable, lifted by his vision, but weighed down by the enormity of what he had created. Because the higher a temple rises, the longer its shadow grows, and the shadow of Angkor stretched far, touching every heart in the kingdom, whispering of glory, ambition, and the danger of reaching beyond one's station. For every stone lifted toward the heavens, something deep in the earth remembered the price.
He came from the margins, born not into unquestioned power, but into the brutal mathematics of succession. In the fractured Khmer world, a prince was not guaranteed a throne. He was merely a contestant in a game where bloodlines sharpened into blades. Suryavarman II understood this earlier than most. From his youth, he moved like a hawk in human form, silent, observant, calculating. His eyes missed nothing. His patience was legendary. And when the moment came to strike, he did so with a ferocity that stunned the kingdom. The old king had grown weak, his authority diluted by factions whispering in half-lit halls. Provinces drifted like islands loosening from a continent. Chieftains tested the limits of royal power, ignoring summons, raising militias, and hinting at rebellion in the measured confidence of their silence. The kingdom needed a ruler who could bind its fractured pieces. Suryavarman offered himself not through diplomacy, but through inevitability. His ascension began with a single night of calculated violence. While court officials slept under the illusion of routine, the prince moved through the palace with warriors loyal enough to stake their lives on a vision only he could see. Their blades glinted under torchlight, their footsteps silent on stone. When dawn broke, the halls were filled with the cold breath of death, and Suryavarman II stood over the bodies of those who had doubted him. He claimed the throne not as inheritance, but as conquest, a declaration that the age of hesitation had ended. The court trembled at first, but soon learned to follow. Power, when asserted with confidence, draws allegiance like iron draws a spark. He reorganized the armies with ruthless precision. Generals were tested, commanders replaced. Loyalty became a currency. Discipline replaced complacency. Soldiers who once served out of duty now marched with purpose. They carried not only weapons, but the weight of the king's ambition on their shoulders. Suryavarman led them personally across plains and forests, across borders long contested, across territories that believed themselves safe behind their distance. His campaigns were swift, decisive, and merciless. Villages that resisted were crushed. Social orders that faltered were rebuilt. Chieftains who hesitated were dragged before him, some spared, others not. Within only a few years, the kingdom that had threatened to dissolve under uncertainty found itself unified under a ruler whose authority felt as inevitable as the monsoon. He was called the Hawk King for good reason. His presence carried the stillness of a predator, the fierce concentration of one who sees further than others. He ruled with a clarity that felt divine, but beneath that clarity lay a storm of ambition. Conquest alone was not enough. Power needed a symbol, something eternal, something that would root his legacy into the soil long after his bones were dust. And so, as the armies subdued the provinces, Suryavarman II turned his gaze to stone. What he envisioned was unprecedented, a temple so vast it would eclipse all others, so serene in beauty that it reflected the order he imposed through force, so meticulous in design that no rival could question the legitimacy of his divine kingship. Angkor Wat was not created to please the gods alone, it was crafted to declare supremacy. Every tower was a crown, every gallery a battlefield conquered, every carving a reminder of who held the reins of fate. The construction began with the confidence of a ruler convinced the future belonged to him. Quarries roared with activity. Rivers carried blocks the size of houses. Thousands labored under a sun that showed no mercy. Suryavarman visited the site often, his gaze sweeping across scaffolding like a general surveying a battlefield. He saw in the rising towers the embodiment of order, his order, etched into the face of the world. The priests interpreted his vision in sacred terms. The people interpreted it as a blessing. His rivals saw something else, a warning. For every stone placed was a declaration of permanence, and permanence invites those who wish to see it undone. Beyond Khmer borders, neighboring kingdoms watched with unease. A ruler who built on such a scale surely intended more than architecture. Suryavarman's forces crossed boundaries, pushing influence into regions whose rulers had grown comfortable in their autonomy. Diplomats arrived at Angkor carrying gifts, but their smiles were strained.
Tribute flowed in, gold, elephants, exotic goods, but tribute given in fear is the seed of future conflict. Inside the royal court, tensions deepened. Ministers who had once wielded influence found their power diminished under the Hawk King's centralizing vision. Some resented the temple's overwhelming demand for labor and resources. Others feared what would happen once construction ended. Would the king turn his attention inward, seeking enemies where none existed? The quiet murmur of dissent began to take shape, not through open rebellion, but through hesitation, through silence, through alliances formed in shadows. Yet Suryavarman pressed forward. Under his command, Angkor Wat took form with precision that bordered on the sacred. The central towers rose above the forests like lotus buds piercing the horizon. Carvings of celestial dancers flowed along the walls, their smiles serene, their curves impossible in their delicacy. The great bas-reliefs chronicled battles and myths, each figure etched with a level of detail that seemed to defy human patience. Visitors marveled at the harmony of scale and symmetry. Soldiers saw in the bas-reliefs the reflection of their own campaigns. Priests bowed to the cosmic symbolism woven into the architecture. And Suryavarman walked through the galleries like a man stepping into his own legend. But legends always carry shadows. As the temple neared completion, the king's attention turned once more to military expansion. He led campaigns beyond the empire's traditional reach. Some succeeded gloriously, others faltered. The neighbors he had intimidated began to form alliances. Some plotted revenge. And in distant chambers, rivals whispered of omens, dry seasons that lasted too long, border skirmishes that dragged on, generals whose loyalty flickered under pressure. The Hawk King felt none of this outwardly. He rode with confidence, issued commands with authority, inspected the temple with calm satisfaction. But inside him, something subtle shifted. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps the quiet realization that the temple he built for eternity would outlive him. Perhaps the weight of enemies gathering like storms beyond the horizon. He had conquered, unified, built, and carved his name into stone. But with every achievement, he had also created expectations that even he could not endlessly exceed. His final years were marked by rumors, illness, exhaustion, internal court conflict, unrest at the fringes of the empire. The sources speak in fragments, as though scribes feared putting the full truth to paper. What is clear is that Suryavarman II died before Angkor Wat was fully completed, leaving the final stone to be placed under another's rule. The temple stood serene, flawless, majestic, yet beneath its beauty lay a quiet unease, a sense that the man who built it had pushed the empire to the edge of its breath. For the Hawk King had risen like a blade, cut through chaos, carved order, and left behind a monument unmatched in scale. But even as Angkor Wat touched the heavens, the shadows beneath it deepened, stirred by rivals, resentments, and the restless weight of ambition. For every king who ascends like a hawk, there is a moment when the wind shifts, reminding him that even the sky has limits.
The fall came like a wound torn across the earth. Smoke lifted above Angkor, thick as a funeral shroud. The invaders swept across the capital with a ferocity the Khmer had not imagined possible. Chariots splintering gates, torches devouring wooden roofs, steel echoing against stone. People ran through the streets with nothing but fear clutched in their hands. Mothers carried children whose cries dissolved into the roar of battle. Monks hid sacred manuscripts beneath collapsed shrines. The empire that once seemed immortal trembled beneath the weight of its own vulnerability. And somewhere in the chaos, a prince watched his world burn. Jayavarman VII did not rise from luxury or predictable destiny. He rose from loss. Exile shaped him, sharpened him, hollowed him. While foreign armies desecrated his homeland, he wandered through territories that did not know his name, listening to stories of Angkor's suffering brought by refugees with haunted eyes. Each tale carved a new scar inside him. Each scar fueled a resolve unlike anything the Khmer had ever seen in a king. When he returned, he did not return as a claimant to a throne. He returned as a storm. The armies he gathered moved with a purpose born not of conquest, but of reclamation. He struck fast, struck hard, struck with the fury of a man reclaiming not just land, but identity. Battles unfolded with brutal clarity. Ambushes in jungles, sieges under monsoon skies, commanders who fought as though faith itself commanded them. Jayavarman rode through the carnage with calm authority, his mind focused on a singular goal: mend what had been broken, rebuild what had been lost, restore not just the empire, but its soul. When Angkor was finally his again, he stood before its ruins in silence. Temples cracked open, statues decapitated, reservoirs choked with debris, homes reduced to ash. The heart of the empire lay exposed, raw, vulnerable. But in that devastation, Jayavarman saw not an ending, but a beginning. He believed suffering could forge greatness, that pain could be reshaped into power. And so he began to rebuild with a speed that terrified even those who loved him. Roads were the first to rise. They cut across the empire in straight, purposeful lines, connecting remote villages with the capital, weaving together communities that had drifted apart. Travelers spoke of rest houses appearing seemingly overnight, shelters built for the weary, stocked with food and medicine. Hospitals followed, places where healers worked under the king's personal directive. For the first time in Khmer memory, compassion became a function of governance, not merely charity. But compassion, in the hands of a man driven by obsession, becomes something sharper. Jayavarman's face rarely betrayed his turmoil. He moved with calm intensity, issuing orders late into the night. When others slept, he studied maps illuminated by candlelight, planning new routes, new temples, new visions of what the empire could become. His advisors whispered that he pushed himself too far, that the kingdom's resources were not infinite, that the people strained under the weight of constant construction. But Jayavarman listened only to the drums of his own heartbeat, pounding in rhythm with the empire's wounds. Then came Bayon. At the heart of Angkor Thom, Jayavarman raised a temple unlike any the world had seen. Towers rose, massive and solemn, carved with serene faces that watched the city from every angle, smiling gently, gazing compassionately, embodying an idealized benevolence. At dawn, mist curled around their lips. At dusk, sunlight softened their gaze. They became the silent guardians of his reign, reflections of the king's belief that salvation required both strength and tenderness. But those smiles hid another truth. As construction expanded, so did the strain on the people. Laborers collapsed from exhaustion. Provinces sent increasingly larger quotas of supplies. Taxes rose. Dissent grew. Some whispered that the king's kindness had turned into a mask, beautiful but unrelenting. Others believed he was trying to heal the empire too quickly, attempting to erase trauma through monuments and mandates. His compassion, once a balm, became a burden. Jayavarman knew this. He felt it. Yet he continued. Temples multiplied. Ta Pram, Preah Khan, Ta Som, each dedicated to family, to ancestors, to compassion, to the memory of those who had been lost.
Each building was a prayer carved into stone, a plea for redemption, for stability, for meaning. But each prayer weighed heavily on the empire's shoulders. The more he built, the more he demanded. The more he demanded, the more the silent cracks widened beneath the surface. His advisors approached him with reports: shortages of grain, unrest in rural districts, fatigue among the workforce. Jayavarman read each report with the calm of a man who understood the cost of inaction far more than the cost of excess. Rebuilding, to him, was not simply restoration, it was penance, a duty owed to the dead, a promise to the living, a final attempt to shape the future before time claimed him. Yet even a king forged by suffering carries limits. As the years passed, his health faltered, his once steady hands trembled, his voice, though still commanding, softened. The war within him, between compassion and obsession, between healing and control, deepened with every structure completed. He paced the corridors of his temples at night, stopping to rest his hand on carved stone, whispering prayers for an empire he feared might one day crumble under its own magnificence. The empire had become a reflection of its king, powerful, compassionate, restless, scarred, and constantly rebuilding itself faster than it could breathe. Behind the stone smiles of Bayon, where faces gazed outward in perpetual serenity, the truth waited like a shadow. The cost of salvation had accumulated, quietly, steadily, relentlessly. Resources stretched thin, people burdened, trade strained. A kingdom rebuilt on the foundation of trauma still carried the weight of its past. But Jayavarman believed that without his relentless vision, the empire would fall back into chaos. He believed the momentum of reconstruction was the only thing keeping despair from returning. He believed that the empire's burning heart, his heart, had to keep beating no matter the cost. And so he built until the end. His final years were a mixture of triumph and fragility. The capital shone with renewed brilliance. Roads connected the horizon. Temples rose like prayers made solid. But behind it all, he sensed a truth he never spoke aloud: that he had rebuilt the empire in the shape of his own suffering, and that when he was gone, the momentum he fueled might begin to slow or spiral. When Jayavarman VII died, the empire entered a long, trembling silence. People gathered beneath the watchful faces of Bayon, staring at the serene stone expressions that had come to define an era. They whispered prayers for their king, for their future, for the burden of greatness he had placed upon their shoulders. Some wept for him, others whispered with fear. Most did both. Because they knew the truth. No empire can burn so fiercely without turning parts of itself to ash. And in the quiet after his passing, the question lingered: who would hold the kingdom together now that the heart that rebuilt it had finally stopped?
The first signs were quiet, too quiet for an empire accustomed to thunder. A missing statue here, a defaced lintel there. Offerings suddenly sparse at shrines that had once overflowed with incense and devotion. The priests spoke of fading faith, but they spoke in private, behind closed chamber doors where uncertainty could not be heard by common ears. Angkor, once the glittering heart of a unified spiritual world, began to murmur with dissonance. The old gods waited on their pedestals, carved in sandstone with eternal poise, yet something in the air suggested their time was slipping. The kingdom had changed. Jayavarman's fever of compassion and construction had left behind a network of temples that breathed with his spirit. But after his death, the question resurfaced: whom did these temples serve? The gods, the king, or the people drifting between different visions of salvation? Monks, wandering from monastery to monastery, carried new doctrines in their weary hands, doctrines colder, stricter, less forgiving. Where once the divine throne anchored heaven to earth, new voices claimed such grandeur was sacrilege. They argued that spirits and ancestors were illusions, that enlightenment came not through worship but through release. These monks did not march in armies, they marched in silence. And silence is the most dangerous weapon in a kingdom built on belief.
It began with the younger novices, boys barely old enough to shave their heads, yet old enough to feel disillusioned by temples adorned with gold while villagers starved after a failed harvest. They whispered in dormitories, asking questions they had been taught never to ask. If the king was divine, why did he fall ill? If the gods were pleased, why had famine bitten so deeply in the countryside? If truth was eternal, why had it begun to shift? Words spread like smoke seeking a crack in the wall. Soon, older monks joined the questioning. Their chants lost the familiar cadence. Their sermons grew sharper, laced with critique, veiled behind imagery that only the attentive could decode. They spoke of humility, of the impermanence of kings, of the transient nature of earthly power. And slowly, the people listened. They leaned closer at monasteries, absorbing this new language of doubt, carrying it back to their homes like sparks from a dying ember. The divine throne felt the tremor. Priests loyal to the old gods saw danger forming but did not know how to stop its spread. They issued warnings, they performed elaborate rituals. They questioned the loyalty of monks who once offered obeisance freely. Yet the more they resisted, the more the rebellion grew. Not the rebellion of swords, but of belief. A kingdom can survive war. It rarely survives when faith begins to fracture. Temples bore the first marks of the rift. At night, unknown hands pried gemstones from statues, not for wealth, but to strip the gods of their splendor. Faces of deities were scratched, eyes gouged, halos chipped. The defacement was surgical, targeted at symbols that represented divine kingship and cosmic authority. Priests found inscriptions altered, offerings scattered, sacred idols turned face down as though in shame. Some wept at the sight, others trembled, knowing what such gestures foretold. The king, no longer divine, merely mortal, ordered inquiries, but inquiries could not tame the shadows. Guards patrolled temple grounds, yet the Vandals moved with the invisibility of shifting ideology. Arrests were made. Some monks disappeared into the depths of royal prisons. But doctrine is not a man. Doctrine has no body to imprison. It slips through bars. It hides in prayer rooms. It spreads among those who feel unseen. And resentment had long been growing beneath the marble calm of Angkor. The populace had lived through construction booms that drained their strength, taxes that tested their endurance, wars that consumed their sons, and droughts that stripped their tables bare. Faith had offered solace. But when faith began to change, when new doctrines promised liberation from the burdens imposed by kings and priests, the people listened with hungry hearts. Belief turned competitive. Village elders debated under the shade of banyan trees. Merchants at markets argued over the merits of old gods versus the new teachings. Families split along spiritual lines. Mothers prayed to Vishnu while their sons meditated under teachers who urged them to abandon idols. The divine throne felt the tremor. Priests loyal to the old gods saw danger forming but did not know how to stop its spread. They issued warnings. They performed elaborate rituals. They questioned the loyalty of monks who once offered obeisance freely. Yet the more they resisted, the more the rebellion grew. Not the rebellion of swords, but of belief. A kingdom can survive war. It rarely survives when faith begins to fracture. Temples bore the first marks of the rift. At night, unknown hands pried gemstones from statues, not for wealth, but to strip the gods of their splendor. Faces of deities were scratched, eyes gouged, halos chipped. The defacement was surgical, targeted at symbols that represented divine kingship and cosmic authority. Priests found inscriptions altered, offerings scattered, sacred idols turned face down as though in shame. Some wept at the sight. Others trembled, knowing what such gestures foretold. The king, no longer divine, merely mortal, ordered inquiries, but inquiries could not tame the shadows. Guards patrolled temple grounds, yet the Vandals moved with the invisibility of shifting ideology. Arrests were made. Some monks disappeared into the depths of royal prisons. But doctrine is not a man. Doctrine has no body to imprison. It slips through bars. It hides in prayer rooms. It spreads among those who feel unseen. And resentment had long been growing beneath the marble calm of Angkor. The populace had lived through construction booms that drained their strength,
taxes that tested their endurance, wars that consumed their sons, and droughts that stripped their tables bare. Faith had offered solace. But when faith began to change, when new doctrines promised liberation from the burdens imposed by kings and priests, the people listened with hungry hearts. Belief turned competitive. Village elders debated under the shade of banyan trees. Merchants at markets argued over the merits of old gods versus the new teachings. Families split along spiritual lines. Mothers prayed to Vishnu while their sons meditated under teachers who urged them to abandon idols.
The empire, once bound by a shared cosmology, now found itself carved into invisible factions. Temples that once echoed with unified worship now murmured with division. And the monks grew bolder. Some preached openly against the wealth of the temples, pointing to the lavish carvings that wrapped Angkor sanctuaries while peasants struggled for rice. They questioned the purpose of divine kingship, insinuating that no man deserved worship. Others turned their sermons inward, focusing on liberation from suffering, teaching that authority, desire, and attachment were chains forged by the powerful. The royal court grew uneasy. Within its walls, ministers argued, priests clashed, factions crystallized. Some feared the collapse of the spiritual order would invite foreign opportunists. Others saw the shift as an inevitable evolution, one that could cleanse the kingdom of corruption. The king himself felt his authority slipping, not through rebellion of weapons, but through rebellion of the mind. He issued decrees demanding reverence for traditional gods, enforcing rituals, reinforcing the cosmic throne. But decrees cannot command belief. One night, under a moon partially hidden by clouds, a statue of a king god cracked in half. Some claimed it was sabotage. Others claimed it was an omen. By dawn, hundreds gathered around the shattered idol, murmuring prayers, curses, questions. The priests tried to calm them, but belief had already fractured. To some, the broken statue was proof of the new doctrines. To others, a warning that the gods were angry. And to the court, it was a sign that unity was collapsing faster than anyone had feared. Temples became battlegrounds, silent, symbolic ones. Monks walked through galleries erasing certain carvings, leaving others untouched. Priests retaliated, repainting sacred images with ritual intensity. Each group believed they were safeguarding the soul of the empire. But between them, a widening chasm swallowed the unity that once defined Angkor. Bayon, the temple of serene faces, became a paradox. Its carved smiles seemed both benevolent and sorrowful. Some monks saw in those faces the embodiment of compassion. Others saw the arrogance of kings. The stone eyes, watching from every angle, reflected nothing but the confusion of a kingdom unsure of who it worshipped or why. As the religious tides surged, political instability followed. Provinces hesitated to send tribute. Generals chose sides quietly. Families who once shared altars divided their loyalties. Belief, once the empire's anchor, had become a weapon. And in a kingdom where myth and power were intertwined, such a weapon cut deeper than steel. No foreign army marched against Angkor during this era of shadows. None needed to. The kingdom warred with itself, one prayer at a time. And by the time the rulers realized how deep the fractures ran, the unity they sought to restore had already dissolved, slipping through their fingers like water fleeing a broken reservoir. For an empire can survive swords and storms, but few survive when their gods begin to fall silent.
It began not with a roar, but with a whisper. A change so small that no court official spoke of it, no scribe recorded it, no priest dared name it. A canal that ran a little slower than before. A reservoir that did not fill as fully as last season. A dry patch of rice field where water should have stood. The empire, massive, confident, adorned in stone and myth, had forgotten the simplicity of its earliest truth, that power flowed with water, and so could wither without it. Angkor's lifelines, once incomparable feats of human mastery, had grown old. Their embankments sagged under centuries of pressure. Their sediment beds thickened year by year, layer upon layer of forgotten storms.
Engineers who once commanded currents found themselves studying shifting riverbeds with uncertainty in their eyes. They reported anomalies, strange flows, unusual eddies, water levels that rose without reason and dropped without warning. At first, the court dismissed these concerns as the complaints of overly cautious men. But caution in an empire built on hydraulics is the first sign of impending catastrophe. The monsoon was changing. For generations, the rains had arrived with a rhythm that seemed carved into the sky itself. A steady pulse, predictable enough that farmers planted by instinct, engineers prepared by habit, and priests proclaimed it a blessing granted by the gods. But now the rains hesitated, or they came too early, or too late, or with such violence that even the largest varais strained under their weight. Water that once obeyed human will began to act with unsettling autonomy. When the monsoon delayed 1 year, farmers looked to the horizon with dread. They walked the edges of their cracked paddies, testing the soil with their toes, praying for the first drops. Weeks passed. The sky remained silent. Reservoirs shrank into shallow basins. Fish died in clusters, their silver bodies catching the sun like scattered coins. Women stood in long lines to collect muddy water from what remained in the canals. And in the heat of that desperate season, whispers spread. The gods were turning away. But nature works in cycles of cruelty. The next year, the rains returned not with grace, but with vengeance. Clouds blackened the sky, winds howled across the plains, lightning fractured the darkness. Torrential storms battered the embankments, cracking them like old bone. Water surged over the reservoir walls, flooding villages before families could flee. Children clung to rooftops. Oxen drowned in fields that had once fed the empire. Monks waded through waist-deep currents to salvage manuscripts floating like fallen leaves. Angkor's greatest strength, the waterways that fed millions, had become unpredictable, unruly, dangerous. And still, the empire tried to mend the wounds. Engineers hurried from site to site, measuring damage with frantic precision. They dredged canals clogged with silt, their bodies blackened with mud and exhaustion. They reinforced reservoir walls with timber salvaged from storm-shattered homes. They dug new channels, trying to coax water back into obedience. But every repair was temporary, every solution fragile. The system had grown too vast, too interconnected, too dependent on perfection. Nature, however, does not honor perfection, only balance. And balance had shifted. In villages, people gathered at night around dying fires, trading stories of strange signs. Dried riverbeds found beneath lush forests, fish abandoning ancient waters, birds migrating at odd times. They spoke of omens in hushed tones, cracked statues, wilting lotus ponds, priests who performed rituals that seemed to fall flat against the sky. Some blamed the shifting religions, claiming the new doctrines had angered ancestral spirits. Others blamed the kings, insisting their excess had drained the empire's fortune. But beneath every explanation lay a deeper fear, that the empire itself had grown too heavy for the land to support. The court felt the pressure like a hand tightening around its throat. Reports poured in of failing harvests, abandoned fields, riots over water rights. Tributary provinces withheld supplies, claiming their own reservoirs were failing. Merchants cursed the canals that once sped trade, but now ran too shallow to carry boats. Even the forest around Angkor shifted, trees leaning, roots exposed, soil eroding in strange patterns. The ground seemed restless, as if remembering a time before human control. The court felt the pressure like a hand tightening around its throat. Reports poured in of failing harvests, abandoned fields, riots over water rights. Tributary provinces withheld supplies, claiming their own reservoirs were failing. Merchants cursed the canals that once sped trade, but now run too shallow to carry boats. Even the forest around Angkor shifted, trees leaning, roots exposed, soil eroding in strange patterns. The ground seemed restless, as if remembering a time before human control. The court felt the pressure like a hand tightening around its throat. Reports poured in of failing harvests, abandoned fields, riots over water rights. Tributary provinces withheld supplies, claiming their own reservoirs were failing. Merchants cursed the canals that once sped trade, but now run too shallow to carry boats. Even the forest around Angkor shifted, trees leaning, roots exposed, soil eroding in strange patterns. The ground seemed restless, as if remembering a time before human control.
Priests performed grand ceremonies to restore cosmic harmony. They burned incense until the streets were filled with fragrant smoke. They summoned crowds to chant through the night, urging the heavens to return to equilibrium. But the rains did not listen, the currents did not bend, and the people who once believed in the absolute unity of land, water, and king now found themselves questioning everything. One season, the central Barre, the great reservoir that symbolized Angkor's mastery over nature, failed. It began with a hairline crack. Engineers noticed it but dismissed it as harmless. The crack widened, embankment stones shifted, water seeped through the gaps like tears. Then, under the weight of an unusually heavy storm, the wall gave way. A roar thundered across the plains as millions of gallons surged outward in a single devastating wave. The flood destroyed everything in its path: homes, fields, roads, lives. The Barre that once fed the empire had consumed it. The disaster shook Angkor to its core. Priests called it a divine punishment. Engineers insisted it was neglect. Farmers declared it the end of an era. The king ordered investigations, repairs, new construction, but the people no longer believed the system could be saved. They felt betrayal in the water itself. And still, the monsoon changed again. Dry seasons lengthened, wet seasons intensified. Reservoirs alternated between starvation and violence. The canals, once symbols of human triumph, became reminders of vulnerability. The empire had built its greatness on the assumption that nature could be controlled, but now it became clear that nature was only lending its strength, and it could reclaim it at any moment. As water and time converged in their silent rebellion, cracks formed not only in the infrastructure, but in the empire's identity. The people who once believed the kings held divine authority over the elements now questioned whether any ruler could tame the sky. Rivals sensed opportunity. Foreign kingdoms watched the weakening of Angkor's lifelines and sharpened their intentions. And the empire, once a symphony of water and stone, found itself struggling to keep a rhythm that had sustained it for centuries. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the reservoirs reflected only the faintest glow of stars, engineers stood on their embankments and stared at their own reflections. They saw exhaustion there, fear, doubt. They understood a truth the court refused to speak aloud. They were no longer lords of the water. They were servants of a force waking from centuries of enforced slumber. Nature had pressed its finger on the scales of power, and the balance had begun to tilt. For even the greatest empire cannot bargain with the river, only watch as it remembers its ancient course. At first, the decline did not appear as catastrophe, but as inconvenience. A merchant caravan arriving late, a riverboat stranded on a sandbar where the current used to run deep, a village found half deserted, its people having slipped away in the night toward rumors of better land farther east. Angkor, accustomed to the slow pulse of its monumental cycles, barely noticed these early tremors. In a capital built on the shoulders of stone giants, decay seemed impossible. But decline, like the jungle that crept at its borders, does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, patiently, in the small spaces overlooked by certainty. The world beyond Angkor had begun to change in ways the empire could not see, or refused to see. Trade routes, once lifelines, shifted like restless serpents. New ports rose along distant coasts where emerging kingdoms embraced maritime wealth with startling speed. Commerce that had once flowed through Angkor's inland arteries drifted toward these new horizons, abandoning the reservoirs and highways Jayavarman had carved through the land. Merchant families who once enriched the capital packed their belongings and followed the winds of change. Their absence left markets thinner, warehouses emptier, and the confident hum of prosperity replaced by uneasy silence. Angkor's rulers responded as their ancestors had, with monuments, decrees, and rituals.
Stone corridors echoed with processions imploring the gods to restore balance. Priests chanted longer, offerings burned brighter. Scribes produced new edicts meant to stabilize trade, regulate taxes, strengthen the borders. But none of these gestures could alter the truth that history was curving away from the old empire, leaving it stranded like a ship on a receding tide. Enemies sensed the vulnerability long before Angkor admitted it. First came the raiders, small bands probing the edges of the kingdom, striking villages where soldiers were few and response slow. They moved with speed and confidence, knowing they were testing a giant grown sluggish. They burned granaries, they stole oxen, they captured children and elders, then vanished into the forests before the empire's patrols could reach them. Each raid seemed minor, but wounds left unhealed fester. The empire stretched its armies thin, trying to plug the growing gaps. Generals who once marched triumphantly under the banners of god-kings now found themselves reacting, not commanding. They chased shadows, remnants of forces that slipped away as quickly as they appeared. And with every pursuit, the empire squandered a little more of its strength it could no longer easily replace. Then came the larger threats, kingdoms that had suffered under Khmer dominance in centuries past. They sharpened their intentions like whetstones against old grievances. Some sought revenge for conquests, others coveted the wealth Angkor had accumulated. And some simply recognized what the capital itself refused to acknowledge: the empire was weakening. The raids grew bolder. Villages burned in clusters. Survivors fled in long lines, carrying what little they could salvage: children on hips, gods in bundles, memories in their eyes. They walked toward safer provinces, toward foreign lands, toward anywhere the jungle did not swallow homes whole. Their stories traveled faster than they did. Stories of fire on rice fields, of soldiers arriving too late, of families scattered in the night. Fear became a currency more common than faith. Within Angkor, the transformation was subtle at first. The grand processional ways, once alive with festivals, diplomats, and traders, became quieter. The markets thinned. Canals filled with silt faster than laborers could dredge them. The bares reflected not bustling activity, but stillness. Birds nested on abandoned boats. Frogs called from corners where merchants once traded spices and silk. But the truest sign of decline was the sound of the temples. For generations, Angkor had breathed through them: the chants of monks, the footsteps of pilgrims, the booming drums of royal ceremony. Now, those sounds softened. Fewer offerings appeared on altars. Some shrines went unattended. A statue cracked after decades of neglect, and no one repaired it. It sat beneath a layer of dust, looking out over a courtyard that had forgotten its own purpose. And, at the city's heart, the jungle waited. Vines crept up the sides of temples where kings had once carved their triumphs.
Roots curled beneath stone foundations, pushing blocks apart with deliberate patience. Trees planted themselves in cracks left by time and turmoil, their branches reaching skyward as though reclaiming the heavens Angkor had tried to capture. The forest did not rush. It had all the time in the world, and time at last was slipping from the empire's grasp. Yet the decline was not uniform. There were years of resurgence, brief breaths between slow suffocation. A prosperous harvest, a successful military counterattack, a new ruler who seemed capable of restoring order. During these intervals, hope flickered. Temples saw fresh offerings, canals were cleaned, soldiers marched with renewed pride. But the momentum never lasted. Each surge met a setback. Each revival ended in another fracture. It was the rhythm of a star dying, not a sudden collapse, but a gradual dimming. The capital watched its own fading with weary eyes. Royal decrees continued to proclaim Angkor's strength, but the people no longer believed them. They saw the truth in the abandonment of once thriving villages, in the scarcity of markets, in the overgrown edges of their own streets, in the way the forest birds seemed louder each year, drowning the chants of priests who could not summon the past back to life. Foreign powers pushed deeper into Khmer territory, sometimes with armies, sometimes with merchants, sometimes with nothing more than the quiet certainty that Angkor could no longer resist. Provinces peeled away like bark from an old tree. Governors pledged allegiance to new masters.
Border towns fell without battle. The kingdom's map shrank, not drawn smaller by enemies, but by erosion. Inside the capital, families made decisions no Khmer had made in centuries. They left. Some departed for new trade centers along the coast. Others followed the Mekong toward lands untouched by the turmoil. Entire communities abandoned their ancestral homes, carrying relics of their past but leaving behind the roots that once tethered them to Angkor's grandeur. The final decline was not a battle. It was an exhale. One day, the processions simply stopped. One season, the priests realized fewer worshippers came to the temples. One year, royal envoys returned to the palace with more warnings than reports. One decade, the crown's authority stretched only as far as the sound of its own voice. When Angkor was eventually abandoned, no chronicler wrote the moment it happened. There was no grand exodus, no last stand, no proclamation carved in stone. People left in waves, some silent, some in sorrow, some with relief. The city emptied slowly, in the same manner it had once filled, through the quiet decisions of thousands. And when the last families departed, when the last warrior sheathed his blade and walked toward a future he did not know, Angkor did not collapse. It simply yielded. The jungle moved in. Roots coiled around columns shaped by kings. Leaves covered walls that once narrated cosmic myths. Trees crowned themselves on rooftops. Monkeys danced through corridors where royalty had once processed. Rain pooled in courtyards that had echoed with ritual hymns. The stone faces of Bayon stared through curtains of vines, their serene smiles now haunting in their solitude. Angkor had not fallen. It had faded, slowly, silently, like a star dimming at the end of its life. Still beautiful, still vast, still echoing the memory of its own light. For some empires do not die in war. They slip into silence, leaving only roots and dust to remember them.
For centuries, the jungle held its silence like a vow. Rain fell on empty courtyards. Wind sifted through broken galleries. Roots tightened around stone with an embrace that was slow, patient, almost tender. Trees grew tall where kings once stood. Birds sang hymns that no human ear heard. The empire did not crumble. It was absorbed, reclaimed by a world older than monuments and memory. Angkor slept beneath layers of moss, vines, and time itself, dreaming of a past it no longer needed to defend. When the first explorers stumbled upon those ruins, they did not find a city waiting. They found a ghost. A path half hidden beneath tangled brush led them toward towers that pierced the canopy like the ribs of an ancient leviathan. The stone faces of Bayon watched them from the shadows, serene, enigmatic, their features softened by centuries of rain. Roots gripped those faces with a quiet possessiveness, as if the jungle feared the explorers might take back what it had claimed. The men stepped closer, brushing aside leaves, tracing carvings with fingers trembling at the weight of discovery. Each step echoed against stone untouched for generations, disturbing dust that had waited lifetimes to rise. They entered corridors dim with green light, where columns leaned like weary elders. Their lanterns cast quivering halos across bas-reliefs that still pulsed with stories. Battles carved in winding lines, celestial dancers trapped mid-twirl, kings offering prayers to gods who had long since withdrawn. The explorers whispered to each other, awed by the magnitude of what they saw. But the stone whispered louder. It whispered of ambition carved deeper than time. Angkor was not dead, it was listening. Every wall, every tower carried the memory of hands that shaped it, of the thousands who bled and sweated to give form to a king's vision. The explorers felt this weight pressing against their skin as they walked, as though the very air demanded reverence. They realized then that they were not the first humans the stones had witnessed, and they would not be the last. One of them paused near a collapsed gateway where a strangler fig had wrapped itself around a fallen lintel. Its roots curled through the stone carvings with the confidence of a conqueror. Here, nature had not merely reclaimed the city, it had rewritten it. The line between architecture and jungle blurred, merging into something both haunting and beautiful.
The explorer knelt, studying the patterns of the roots, seeing in them not ruin, but transformation. The jungle was not a villain, it was the final custodian. Still, the explorers searched deeper. They climbed stairways slick with moss, peered into sanctuaries drowned in shadow, brushed aside centuries of debris to reveal inscriptions faint as fading breaths. They sketched, measured, documented, but what they felt could not be captured on paper. For at every turn, they sensed a presence, an echo of intention. The stones seemed to ask them a question whose answer had eluded kings. What is power, if even stone forgets its makers? They wandered into Angkor Wat, its galleries stretching endlessly beneath the morning sun. Pillars rose like trees reincarnated in stone, their shadows stretching along across the flagstones. The great central tower loomed above them, weathered yet resolute, a monument to devotion and defiance. Birds circled its heights, their cries drifting down like fragments of forgotten ritual. Inside the temple, they studied the bas-reliefs, the churning ocean of creation, the epics of gods and demons, the battles fought under Suryavarman's unblinking gaze. Here, time had worn the carvings into soft silhouettes, but their meaning still pressed against the senses. The explorers realized the kings had carved themselves into myth, not out of vanity, but out of fear. Fear that memory fades, fear that power slips, fear that time swallows everything. It had not saved them. The god-kings vanished. Their armies dissolved. Their rituals fell silent. But their questions remained, etched into walls too massive to fall, too sacred to erase. What is power? How long can it last? And who decides when it ends? Angkor answered only through silence. As the explorers moved deeper, they reached pools where the sky reflected upside down, a world inverted, as if the heavens themselves were remembering differently. Leaves drifted on the surface, circling like forgotten offerings.
The stones around the pool bore faint scars of restoration attempts made ages ago, patches where artisans had tried to hold the empire together with mortar and hope. The jungle had outlasted them all. One explorer dipped his hand into the water. Ripples spread outward, dispersing the sky's reflection. It was an image of empire itself, a moment of clarity, followed by distortion, then disappearance. He stood, breath-catching, realizing that for all their monuments, the ancient Khmer had been no different from him, trying to grasp something fluid, something impossible to hold. As they ventured toward Top Rome, nature's victory became undeniable. Trees soared from the temple's broken heart, their roots cascading down walls like petrified waterfalls. Trunks split corridors, branches pierced roofs. The explorers felt small here, dwarfed by the duel of stone and life. They whispered that the place seemed enchanted. But enchantment was only another word for memory too vast to comprehend. Here, the roots did not grip stone, they embraced it, as if comforting a fallen friend. One explorer placed his hand against a root thicker than his torso. It pulsed faintly with life, life that had begun long after the last king fell, life that would continue long after the explorers were gone. He understood then the final truth Angkor had been hiding. The empire had not been defeated by war, nor by famine, nor by politics alone. It had been defeated by time. And time does not hurry. When the explorers finally left, they carried their maps, sketches, and stories, but the jungle remained unmoved. It had watched empires rise and fall. It had seen stone outlast flesh. It had reclaimed Angkor not out of malice, but out of inevitability. And beneath the canopy, the temples continued their patient vigil. Faces of kings, softened by centuries, gazed eternally into the shadows. Their stone smiles held neither pride nor regret, only acceptance. Roots coiled around them like threads stitching together two worlds, one human, one ancient, both destined to fade. The explorers' footsteps vanished down the causeway. The birds resumed their songs. The leaves settled. The jungle inhaled, exhaled, and closed its green curtains once more. Angkor returned to waiting, silent, timeless, undisturbed. For some questions echo forever in stone, unanswered, unresolved, and content to wait for the next soul brave enough to listen.